Well, thanks, Earl. I'm not a Bible scholar. Let me disclaim that right up front. If you want to talk about Bible, you can go talk to Molly Zahn or Paul Marecki. We have good people in the department. This is based on something I do. I teach an introductory course at American Religion 100 level course. Try to cover a lot of different topics, and one topic I cover is the Bible, because although the Bible is this famous great icon in our society, my experience is quite a few people, including a whole lot of true believers, don't know very much about it. Anyway, there are lots of problems, as we're going to see, in just understanding just what it is and how it works. So I kind of basically want to give you a freshman level lecture. I apologize for insulting those who are well educated in these things. If you go to sleep, try not to snore, please. But I think my experience is quite a few people are in the same boat as the average KU freshman. You know what the Bible is, and you know it's a big deal in the culture, but where it came from, how we got it, how we use it, that's, I think, not something as much discussed, even among the most devout believers. So it seems to me there's several levels of what we have to look at when we're considering the Bible. I've got a few basic words here. Canon, I think, is a good starting point. Canon, in this sense, just means list. It's a Greek word. And list of what? Well, it's the list of books in the Bible, simply. The question of canon is, what do we include and what do we not? Well, it's not like God came down on Mount Sinai and said, here it is. The canon was something that was many, many centuries in coming together. It's really about 2,500 years ago that there began to be a sense of canon among the Jews. After the exile, the Babylonian exile, around that time, 6th century BCE pretty much, there was a sense of trying to regularize this kind of diverse and undefined bunch of writings, and the Torah really seems to have emerged at about that time. So we've had the Torah for the first 5 books of the Bible basically for about 2,500 years in something like the form they're in now, and accepted as authoritative. That's an important part of it. Prophets were next. Quite a few prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible, but the standardized version of them is much later. In fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are around the time of Jesus, have shown us that there were many variant readings in the prophets even then, hundreds of years after the prophets were supposed to have lived. So no real established canon there until fairly late. And then the third category of the Hebrew scripture, what we usually just call the writings, or some people say wisdom literature, which is the catch-all category. Things like Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job and stories and poems and different things. That's later still, and that took a long time to be standardized. Really all the way down to the Council of Jamnia at the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. So what had been kind of generally accepted as the Hebrew Bible by the turn of the eras between BCE and CE was basically about 7 books longer than the version that Protestants, at least, and Jews have today. What happened really was that in the horrible tumult of the end of the 1st century, the great Roman-Jewish War, starting in the decade of the 70s, terrible problems and deportations and all kinds of things happening, there was a real fear that with the dispersion of the people of Israel, how are we going to keep it together? How are we going to keep some kind of focus if we're scattered all over the world? And one of the basic answers was, we need to agree on what the Bible is. So by the 1st century, they still didn't have that really very clearly defined. And in this midst of all the chaos going on at the end of the 1st century, a group of rabbis met at this little coastal village of Jamnia and basically sat down and said, we're going to resolve it. And they defined it. And we got basically the Jewish Bible we have today, which Protestants later adopted as theirs. So at that point, books that had generally been considered biblical, like Baruch and Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, some others, were simply cut off. Parts of other books, Daniel and Esther particularly, had pieces of them cut out. So anyway, that became, we kind of had a canon at that point. We didn't have final texts really yet. Final texts of the Hebrew Bible, if there is such a thing, really we're talking another 1,000 years or so. The Masoretes come into that equation. They were the scribes who sat down and tried to work out a really definitive text. And it wasn't until around the year 1000 that we had that pretty well defined. We don't have a Hebrew Bible that's well agreed upon today for an interesting reason, I think. Before the Council of Jamnia, before this shortening of the Bible took place, there had been a kind of a general acceptance of this longer version, these extra books and things. And because the standard lingua franca of the Mediterranean world was Greek, Koine Greek, it's called Koine because it's common form of Greek. That was the standard language. Any educated person, like English today really, any educated person who wanted to travel, that was the language that got you by. So once that became the established language, and that was after Alexander the Great that became common, well, so what do? You naturally need the Bible in the language that everyone can read. You want to share this, you want to look at it. Not everyone reads Hebrew, so let's take a look at it. Besides, Hebrew by then was a dead language, so let's get it into something people can understand. So it was translated before the time of Jesus into this version that's called the Septuagint, meaning 70, because supposedly there were 72 translators, and they all miraculously, the great miracle stories basically about it with the way they got this perfect translation. But the problem is they had the longer version, and Judaism later cut it off. Well, when the Catholic Church went to establish a Bible, they didn't go back to the Hebrew original. They simply got the Septuagint, the Greek version, and translated it into their own language, which was Latin, of course, the Vulgate Bible, and it's the long version. So to this day, the Catholics have a notably longer Bible than Protestants do. And for that matter, as if that's not enough confusion, other parts of Christianity have different Bibles. Eastern Orthodox Christianity has yet more than the Catholics have. Book of Psalms that both Catholics and Protestants as well as Jews accept is 150 Psalms. Eastern Orthodox have 151. And they've also got some other materials that are not accepted elsewhere. They have a Catholic Bible has 2 books of Maccabees, Orthodox Bible has 3. So anyway, more stuff, and if you want to get even farther afield, go into Egypt and Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Bible, which is ancient, this goes back to early days of Christianity. It's much, much longer than even the Eastern Orthodox Bible. So we say Bible, but canon's an issue. There are all kinds of different texts, kind of lists of what we have in it. And I would say there's no consensus really on it. So the Catholics kept their longer version. So how did Protestants get the Jewish version, the shorter version? Well, simply because Luther didn't like the Catholic Church, basically, of course, and didn't like their Bible much. So he said, let's just go back to the Jewish Bible. And he translated his German Bible from Hebrew. So that was the basic reason. I have to think his theology and his own temperament probably influenced it as well. But anyway, we have several different Bibles in the matter of canon, and I think that's a fairly important starting point. So that's all Hebrew Bible canon, what Christians call the Old Testament. What about New Testament? There's a canon there as well, of course. Where'd that come from? Well, in the first century, there was nothing that we know that was written down. We have oral tradition. People began to tell stories. And finally, people began to write things down somewhat. There's always, after a generation or so goes by, a recognition that you better get this down, you better get this record before the people who really have the original material are all gone. So people began to write things down. And it's really in the first half of the second century there begins to be an accumulation of some of these materials that are considered normative. We're going to understand the life of Jesus and the life of the early church and the theology that goes along with it. But there's not much of a development of canon until the end of the 2nd century. The first list, actually, that we have, the first canon of the New Testament, written by an ancient writer named Marcion, comes at the end of the 2nd century. And you know what the first canon was? What the list was? It was the Gospel of Luke, but not the version we have today, a different version of it, and 10 of the letters of Paul. And Marcion says this is the authoritative material, this is the New Testament. That's the oldest New Testament we have. Well, basically, over time, of course, people began to take other things as authoritative, and gradually there just developed a sense that this is what the canonical writings are. But it wasn't until around the year 400 or so that it was generally accepted that we have the 27 New Testament books that we have today. The oldest list that we have, the oldest canon that has the same 27 books we have today, dates to the year 367. Athanasius compiled a list, and this is in the 4th century when there's so much conflict trying to define Christianity going on. Athanasius promulgated a list, and that's the oldest one that we have of our current books. But might note that even though this was the definitive New Testament, he said, he also gave a second list of books he said were pretty good. So you should read, for further edification, The Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, the Wisdom of Solomon, things like that. They're okay too, even though they're not quite at the same level. 4th century is a big time of change, though, because that's when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire with Constantine. Until Constantine came along, there were lots of different Christianities around, pretty localized and pretty different. Gnostic Christianity, for example, particularly in North Africa, had quite a following and a pretty different approach to Christianity, different texts, and very different ideas about just what was definitive there. So what happened in the 4th century basically was suddenly the weight of the Roman army was thrown behind one particular version of Christianity. There was a fairly aggressive hunting down of heretics, which is anyone who doesn't think like we do, and particularly the Gnostics and the Arians, another group defined as heresy. They had a somewhat lower view of Jesus than the Roman Church did. Vicious suppression of those people. And eventually, power goes to the winners, right? So they're the ones who define what we have. But a lot of our understanding of the Bible just comes from those power struggles in the 4th century. In any event, that's canon, but we still are working on text today, which is really the next issue. So, okay, we've got the list. These are the books, but what is the text of those books? What is the content? Well, that is something that has been worked on endlessly, practically, and working on that goes up to the present time. We don't have any original texts, okay? Nothing that goes back to the very beginning of Christianity, or Judaism, certainly. In terms of the New Testament, this is the oldest known text of all. Around the year 150, and I'm sure you recognize what this is, right? This is a fragment of the Gospel of John. This is all there is to it. This is the complete earliest text. Not exactly all that useful for understanding the Bible. But as time has gone by, we have discovered better and better texts. Archaeology has turned things up. In the 20th century, 2 really huge discoveries greatly advanced our knowledge of the ancient world, ancient Christian texts. Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, gave us, and as I think I said earlier, kind of helped prove that there were variant readings of things that even by that time, which is around the time of Jesus roughly, still debates over what the text was. The other thing that happened around the same time, actually, though not better known until later, the Nag Hammadi texts, which were dug up in Egypt, and they were mainly Gnostic in orientation and helped us understand that there was a very powerful tradition outside the main Roman Church. So anyway, their texts have come along. The 19th century saw quite a lot of improvement in texts. And today, if you get a critical edition of the Bible, I have a critical New Testament here, and this is a page out of it. What it does is the critical work in the front tells you how they came up with the text that they use, where it all came from. So scholars take hundreds of different texts and try to decide which are the most authentic. And what's most authentic? Well, time is part of it. Early is considered better generally, but not necessarily entirely, because it might represent a dissident point of view. So this is just one of several pages in the front of this critical Nestle edition of the New Testament, which is considered pretty standard. Here it is. This is all in German, but this is time period for these things. So these important things, the little P things here on the left, upper left, that's papyrus pieces. These are usually fairly fragmentary. And this is the age of them. Notice nothing in that list is earlier than the 3rd century. We do have a few things, like I say, back to the 2nd, but mostly it's 3rd, 4th, 5th. So those are the papyrus fragments. These other things with capital letters, starting with the Hebrew Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and then Roman alphabet. Those are all larger vellum manuscripts that have been found and preserved from ancient times, found in various places. The ones that are considered early and authentic, Sinaiticus from the Sinai Desert in Egypt, Alexandrinus from Alexandria originally, Vaticanus, which is housed in the Vatican in Rome. Things like that. Those three are considered very important texts, but they don't all read the same. They're different, so scholars have to sit down and try to balance and figure out how they work together. But notice the age. Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, 4th century, and Alexandrinus, 5th century. That's hundreds of years go by before we get what we today consider the most important text. And once again, what that's telling us is it's just impossible to really go back to the original. There are lots of stories that I think are intriguing around all of this. A great story about Constantine Tischendorf, kind of a swashbuckling German intellectual. The story that he told, he went out to the Sinai Desert to St. Catherine's Monastery, which is itself an Eastern Orthodox church. And he said that while he was there, he found a biblical manuscript in a wastebasket, and what its fate was going to be, it was simply going to be tossed into the fire, to be fire started, kindling. So he did a great heroic thing by saving that manuscript from destruction. And let me just say before I go on, the Orthodox vehemently deny Tischendorf's story. The Orthodox are very historically oriented. The idea that they would burn a manuscript that was obviously precious is really repugnant to them. In the Orthodox point of view, and I think they're right basically, Tischendorf's just a thief. But Tischendorf gave us Sinaiticus, one of our very best manuscripts, one of the real keys to understanding the Bible. Anyway, Tischendorf was also a mercenary. There's a page out of Codex Sinaiticus. He eventually, Russia at that point kind of considered itself the flagship church of Eastern Orthodoxy. So he managed to sell it to the Russian government, the Tsarist government. And then, of course, later on, the communists come along. Well, they know they've got something pretty valuable. What do you do with it? Let's sell it. So in 1933, for a large amount of money, the Russians sold Sinaiticus to the British, and it's now in the British Library in London. And it's on display. You can actually go out and look at it if you go to London. But anyway, it greatly improved the understanding of what the text of the Bible was. I would just end all of that by saying we don't know what's left out there to be discovered, but probably quite a bit. Okay, so we've got canon then, and we've established a text as best we can. But there's still, well, I guess I should back up and say this is just an example of where later finds have changed our understanding of text. This is the end of the Gospel of Mark. Starting with the 9th verse of the last chapter, there's some stories that end up with the famous passage down here in verse 18 that tells us to drink deadly things and handle snakes. And anyway, the last part of the Gospel of Mark, if you get to a modern translation today, later manuscript finds have pretty well removed that. Here's Revised Standard, which is based on pretty solid scholarship. Notice this, it quits with verse 8. They put the rest of it in a footnote saying, we used to think this was part of the Bible, we don't anymore. For people who use King James, it's still part of the Bible. So all the text issues are not fully resolved yet, for sure. Translation, the Jewish Bible was written in Hebrew, mainly a little bit of Aramaic in it, and then of course New Testament written in Greek. At that point we're already looking at translation because Jesus spoke Aramaic, so we don't have any Aramaic original New Testament documents at all. They're all in Greek. For a long time, it wasn't too big an issue. Churches used the ancient languages. Eastern Orthodox still today mostly use ancient languages. And so translation to reach the lay people of the church is not a big issue. Catholic Church, of course, very early translated it into Latin, but then until modern times, that's all there really was authoritatively. It's only in the less than a century the Catholic Church has really opened up to English Bibles. So translation's a big issue. Well, we have King James, of course, as kind of the flagship of the English language translations. And I actually think it's pretty good. It's fairly literal. They put words that when they add a word to make it more clear, they put it in italics. There's some useful things in it. I think the biggest problem with King James is simply that in the last 400 years, the English language has changed. Words don't all mean exactly what they mean. We don't talk like they did in Shakespeare's day, which is what we're talking about here. So for that reason, I think it really has some limitations for us today. There is actually something out today called the New King James Version, which kind of takes care of some of the bigger language problems, but many still remain. The Revised Standard Version is kind of an update of King James, but it is limited. It's used in many of the mainstream churches, more liberal churches, not in most conservative churches. I would say mainly for political reasons. The revision was sponsored by the National Council of Churches, which the conservative Protestancy is a nest of commies, so they won't use it basically. There are, of course, lots of modern language translations out there today. My sense of it is they tend to be a little bit loose with the text. They're mainly trying to communicate. They want